Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our coverage of the 2015 Zurich Chess Challenge. We are in round 2 today. Our competitors, white's going to be played by Anand, and black's going to be played by Aronian. So two of the top players in the world. Anand gets the party started with pawn to d4, as we see him so often do. Knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, knight c3, and then pawn to d5. So getting into the Grunfeld defense from black, Anand decides to go ahead and opt for the Russian system, the knight here to f3. After bishop to g7, fianchetting on the king side, we see queen to b3. Putting a lot of pressure on this square here on d5, pretty much forcing black's hand to go ahead and take this pawn here on c4. White's going to recapture here on c4. So white definitely has the advantage in the center of the board in this variation. Black's looking to counter later on. Also, he can start to put a lot of pressure on this queen that's a little bit exposed, not really supporting any other minor or other major pieces. So not something you want your queen typically to do, but if you can really hold control of the center of the board with this queen, it can definitely give you benefits down the end of the road. We see castle on the king side, pawn up here to e4, continuing the center control, and then knight to a6. Somewhat of an interesting move. It's the Prinz variation. It's a variation that Kasparov used to play a lot against Karpov in the World Championships when he used to play. So definitely not the most uncommon, but you don't see it all that often. It is somewhat awkwardly placed here on a6. A few moves later, after bishop here to e2, we see pawn here to c5. C5 is the reason for playing this a6. It supports it later on. Ideally you would have this pawn take here on c5, and then this knight could eventually take, the bishop could come here to e6 first after we see take bishop here to e6, kind of forcing this queen away, kind of open up the door if the rook wants to come over here to c8. This is going to be very good. But Anand decides to go ahead and try something different. He plays pawn here to d5, and this could be pretty awkward for Aronian playing the black pieces, because this pawn here on c5, although it does control the center of the board, especially this pawn or the square here on d4, the knight's just awkwardly placed now. It can't go anywhere productive. Pawn here to c5 is kind of blocking it. The outpost here on b4 is not going to do much, because just a simple pawn here to a3 is going to force that back. So not the greatly placed piece right here on a6. So black's definitely going to be looking to move this into a better square, because if it stays here all game, that's definitely going to be very, very bad. Anand played a similar type of game like this against Magnus Carlsen in game 10 of the 2014 World Chess Championship. You can go take a look at that if you want to. There's definitely some slight variations that we see in this game, but he's going to be looking to push forward with this pawn here, and then again eventually try to promote this on this d file, or if he wants to, he could maybe push this e-pawn past and get a promoted pawn is there. We now see pawn to e6, trying to break up the center of the board. Castle on the king side, take here on d5, and then white recaptures here on d5. Anand doesn't want to go ahead and take with this pawn here on e6, because again, he's looking to keep this central square here, and so after the exchange, this is exactly what he wants. He wants to continue to add pressure here on this d file. Now the rook over here to e8, and then he plays rook to d1, and this is interesting because in this exact same setup when he played against Magnus Carlsen just a few months ago, he played bishop here to g5, and this eventually led to a pretty quick drawn game. Anand's not playing for a draw, especially with the white pieces. He's looking up top for him. He sees Nakamura won a game yesterday, so he knows that he needs to go ahead and get a win in this position. He feels pretty confident, so he has been studying this game, he said, and so he decided to play rook here to d1, adding a lot more support on this pawn pushing forward to d5, instead of just giving it up a little easier than he did against Magnus Carlsen, giving a lot more support with the rook here to d1. Bishop here to f5, centralizing that bishop, pawn pushing forward here to d6. Again, anytime you have a passed pawn, you need to push that passed pawn, just putting more and more pressure on your opponent. It's always going to be a good thing. Pawn here to h6, bishop here to e3, just getting more material involved in the game. You always want it to develop your minor pieces, connect your rooks on the back row. They always do better connected. Controlling these long files are always going to be good. Knight here to g4. bishop here to f4. And this is also interesting because Vishy Anand's about to sacrifice material with the move after the bishop takes here on c3. Now we see the rook come down here to e4, forcing this queen to move, but then basically hanging this bishop here on f4. But Vishy Anand said that he had prepared for this, and this is the variation that he actually wanted to go down. So he plays queen up here to b5, attacking this pawn here on b7. So after the rook takes here on f4, we see the queen up here on b7. And so all of this material, we see this bishop or this queen here on b7 getting ready to push forward to d7. He has the light square bishop that he can always deploy if he wants to add another defender on the square here on d7. He has his rook here on d1. He can always double his rooks here on the d file if he wants to add more pressure to this pawn right here. So he gave up material willingly, knowing that he had prepared, and he wants to continue to push forward with this pawn and eventually try to promote this. We now see the rook swing over here to a4, trying to hold down a little bit of support of this knight here on a6. But as you can see, Aronian, although up in material, he's just kind of playing defense. All of his pieces aren't really coordinated. The rook here on a8's not really connected, doing much of anything. The rook here on a4 is really awkwardly placed, just defending this knight here on a6. And this is even more awkwardly placed. You never want your knight here on a6. There's no place for it to really go. You can't come here to b4 just because the pawn's right here. His own pawn's kind of blocking it, but he really doesn't have the time or the tempo to actually move this anywhere, so that's going to be bad. His knight can't come up here to c6. That's going to be bad. Just bringing it back here to b8 seems terrible. Just seems kind of a wasted move right here. So Vishy Anand trying to take advantage of the fact that his pieces are a lot more coordinated, now pushes up here to d7, and from the here on out, that we're in move 19, Aronian was taking about 20 minutes a move. He was trying to find a way to hold on to the material, but he just couldn't find the best moves. He plays bishop here to e4, trying to force the hand of this queen. This queen comes back here to b3, actually a really nice square attacking this rook. Now the bishop comes up here to c6, attacking this pawn here on d7. Probably a bad move from Aronian. Instead, he probably could have just played rook here to a5, kind of taking the threat away from the queen here. But after the bishop comes up here to c6, although it does look like it is, attacking this pawn here on d7, it allows Vishy Anand to bring his rook up here to d6. This not only threatens both the minor pieces here on the 6th rank, but also allows this rook to come over here to d1. Add even more pressure to this d file, which Vishy Anand is just completely dominating right now. The bishop comes up here, taking on d7. He had a few other moves. I mean, he could have tried pawn here to c4 if you wanted to. Not a lot of great moves, though. Decides to play bishop here to d7, and then rook over here to d1. This is, again, just adding more and more pressure here. There's no way to really hold on to this d file. Decides to go ahead and get his queen out of the way. So the rook up here, taking here on d7. A queen down here. Aronian wants to get more material off the board. He can't allow his opponent, with all of his pieces so coordinated, to control that queen right there. But after the pawn takes, the rook comes down here to the 2nd rank, which typically is good, having your rook on your opponent's 2nd rank or 7th rank, depending on your color. To bring now the bishop here to c4, you can start to see all hope kind of going away from black. All the pieces are really coordinated from Vishy Anand. His bishop right here, nice little outpost attacking this square here on f7. His rook right here attacking f7, completely dominating this d file right here. So things are definitely looking good for white. Black's going to have a hard time to hold on to even a draw for this game. We now see black bring his rook over here to f8, just trying to protect this material here on f7. Again, that's kind of what black has to do. He has to try to just defend as much as possible. Rook over here to d6. He can always play this rook over here to g6, takes material. This pawn can't move. It is being pinned down by this bishop right here, so that's going to be good. King here to g7, trying to stop this attack on the g6 pawn. But now the rook can just swing over here, take this material on a6, also protected by the bishop here on c4, which is a great piece. Rook over here taking on f2, but that's, it's not going to do too much. All it can really do is take this pawn right here. So rook over here to e1, getting ready to bring this rook over into the action. And so Aronian decides to go ahead and resign in this position. He's down in material. White's going to be able to take this material here on a7 if he wants to. He eventually is going to have a majority of the pawns on the queen side. He's he's going to be able to push forward. This rook here on f8's never really going to be able to move after this rook here on a7, just adding too much pressure on the king side, and so black decides it's just not worth it, so he resigns. So very, very well done by Vishy Anand. He took a pretty devastating draw in Game 7 from the World Championships not too long ago that he really, really needed to win, and he improved upon it. He studied, found definitely a better move, employed it against Aronian, who just had no answer. He was just fumbling and took way too long for all his moves and just could never find the best way to defend, even though he was up in material. So congrats to Vishy Anand. He goes into a tie for first place with Nakamura for first place, and so we'll have tomorrow round 3, but hopefully you guys enjoyed watching. Hopefully you learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.